Welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. See this? I have a bizarre fondness for it. Old school players may recognize that I'm currently showing you a screenshot from the character creation screen of Blood Elves circa TBC. Almost notoriously, Blood Elves were the only race incapable of being warriors, an option eventually granted to them in Cataclysm. It seems the only reason they couldn't before that was that otherwise Blood Elves would be the only race with access to 7 classes, or 8 as of Wrath. A stupid reason, one could very easily argue, but I really appreciate what it represented. Races having trade-offs, as clearly Blood Elves were not lacking in class options, and races having distinctions. Yes, I get it. Anyone could logically be a warrior. It's perhaps a nonsensical limitation, but it made enough sense to me. Blood Elves were a very magical and lithe race. Of course they would be more proficient at other classes. Over the years, restrictions on race class combos have been loosened bit by bit, sometimes simply for logic, sometimes to give players more options, and more frequently from the devs adopting a more D&D logic to it all. That being that reasonably, just about any race could have a sparse few practitioners of any given class, so why not let the players live out whatever personal fantasy they wish to? Yeah, a Night Elf Warlock might be an exceedingly rare thing within their society, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. The only classes exempted from this, thus far, seem to be those that would require extra art assets such as druid forms. And I absolutely get the logic of even this latest cause for change. There are a lot of good reasons for it, but I, personally, am more bothered by the negative impact it has on racial identity. I recognize it's a bit of a selfish concern, but hey, I'm just a YouTuber. My opinions don't matter anyway. And so we arrive at the thesis of this video. Race class combos in WoW are an utter mess right now. Generally being too loose, but in a few instances actually being too strict. Let's run through them class by class, and I'll share my thoughts. We may as well start with the aforementioned warriors. With the exception of Blood Elves, every single race has been able to be warriors since the moment of their implementation, save for Drakthir, who got it one expansion later. This makes sense. Warrior is about as basic of a skill set as you can get, and requires no real lore to argue for, at least before you start considering stuff like thunder manipulation. You could argue that some of the smaller races like gnomes and goblins wouldn't make for ideal warriors, but that doesn't seem to have ever been a consideration. My personal stance is that while it makes sense for every race to be a warrior, I would still prefer if a few races couldn't, as in my Blood Elf example, just to show that certain skill sets aren't as emphasized in certain cultures. The next most ubiquitous class we have is Hunters, which, again, is pretty understandable for every race to be able to learn. In vanilla, every race other than gnomes, humans, and undead could be Hunters. Humans and undead were added to the list in Cata, gnomes in Legion, and thereafter every race could be Hunters right away, save again for Drakthir and their one expansion delay. Undead in particular were an odd exclusion considering Sylvanas is herself categorized as a hunter. Like with warriors, there aren't any races I would say don't make sense as hunters, and would merely withhold it from a few to reduce racial homogenization. Leave it for those with a stronger emphasis on archery or living among nature or with beasts, like elves and orcs. While we're sticking to mostly physical, practical classes, let's touch on rogues. The only real logical restriction here is perhaps an affinity for shadow magic, and of course, the practicality of sneaking around. As such, the sizable Tauren were the only vanilla race that couldn't be them, followed up by the Draenei in the Burning Crusade. Thereafter, again, we see every race getting them right away, other than High Mountain Tauren, Lightforged Draenei, and Drakthir. Drakthir, again, came one expansion late, while the Tauren and Draenei races got access during Dragonflight. Even the large races can make sense as rogues, considering the scale of enemies in this game, but yet again, I would have left them out for the sake of variety. How about priests then? It started out pretty simple, everything except gnomes, orcs, and Tauren in vanilla. Cata extended it to everyone but orcs. Some of these were weird inclusions. Gnomes and goblins never seemed particularly religious, and Tauren's relation to the light felt awkward. I'll touch on them more when we get to paladins. Thereafter, everyone would get them right away, save for Drakthir for one expansion. Even Megheart orcs due to the Shadow Priests from the Shadowmoon clan. The only holdouts were orcs and High Mountain Tauren until Dragonflight. I'll admit, most races are believable for priests, but some are just a little less believable than others, such as Earthen if we're not considering Skarden, and I appreciated the differentiation. Continuing with Clothies, we have mages. Only half of vanilla races could be one, and of those, trolls felt a bit random to be honest. Kata extended it to all races save for Tauren, and thereafter, well, you guessed it, everyone had immediate access except for Drakthir for one expansion, and Tauren and High Mountain Tauren in Dragonflight. While Mage sounds like a fairly approachable class for anyone, I definitely think certain races feel a bit out of place, particularly any of the more naturey ones, hence why Tauren were such a long holdout. Orcs and Mag'har orcs also feel a bit weird. Perhaps the most egregious offense was giving Night Elves access. Yes, it's explained away by Mordant Evenshade and other Shendril mages being brought back into Darnassian society, but a huge component of Night Elf culture was their rejection of magic due to the Sundering and the Highborn culture that led up to it. So I absolutely think Mage should have been a less widely available class. Warlocks then. These also started out only being open to half the vanilla races, and all of them made quite a bit of sense. Generally, the races that were denied access to it were the more naturey, like Tauren and Night Elves, or kinder ones like Pandaren. It wouldn't join the ranks of available to all classes until Dragonflight, when a whole bunch finally gained access. Some, like those I mentioned, just feel weird from a vibes perspective, but others feel downright sacrilegious or nonsensical. Draenei and Lightforged Draenei feel completely antithetical to the class, even if you're looking at the most obscure outcasts. I can kind of make sense of Draenei if you're considering Eridar skins, which, let's not open up the whole can of worms of why that's a skin and LFDs are a separate race. But really, in what universe does a Lightforged Draenei warlock make any sense? But the worst offender is actually probably Mag'har orcs. Even non-practitioners who were in proximity of fel magic had their skin permanently turned green. It makes zero sense for an actual user to remain Mag'har for more than one day. It's stupid and you cannot convince me otherwise, not even if you include a whole questline about extending the class to all races, which Blizzard did, and it still doesn't land for me. Paladins are one of the few classes that hasn't become universal yet. Heck, they even started out Alliance only. Really, only races with a very clear connection to the light have access. This has caused an Alliance lean that still continues to this day. Zandalari can be a bit iffy, but priests make sense for them, so paladins kind of do by extension. They're channeling the light through the Loa. Razan in particular at first, and now Grawl, according to Alonsis anyway? The Shark Loa being the most light-oriented is a weird choice, but okay, I guess. I kind of want them to make sense just because I have one as a result of me obsessively not wanting any duplicate races among my characters. Earthen also feel a bit odd, as do Tauren, despite the lore surrounding the Sunwalkers and Anshe. Sometimes the lore exists, and it's just vibes that make something feel stupid. I'm sorry, Tauren Paladins are just hard for me to swallow, despite the holy cow jokes, and the Ret Bull jokes. To be fair, maybe they would have landed better for me if they had introduced armor like this trading post set much earlier on instead of sticking Desco in T6. Shaman were the Horde counterpart in vanilla and have also remained somewhat restricted, though the Horde favoritism has sort of vanished. I actually don't have any complaints at all with these ones. All the races that can be Shaman seem to fit very well, even Dwarves and Earthen via their Storm Riders. Kultirans are also a standout for a very unique flavor of Shamans via their Tide Sages. Whereas Shamans fell off as the Horde class, Druids sort of rose up. It was originally only available to Night Elves and Tauren. Worgen and Trolls were natural extensions. The former practically are Druids by nature, and the latter had been shapeshifting since vanilla. Zandalari Trolls and High Mountain Tauren were natural extensions, and the Haranir have a very prominent Druid presence in their culture. Again, Kultirans are a standout for their very unique Druids, the Wicker-style Drust. Really, I have no complaints here either. It's perhaps a bit too limited in options overall, but there are no other races I think they can fittingly extend to. Maybe Volpera? Maybe? That's it for vanilla classes, so what about Death Knights? Well, due to being risen from the dead of other races, it really isn't restrictive at all. We've basically had two waves of them. The Third War Death Knights that all pre-mop races could be, and the Bolvar-era Death Knights that were made available with the Shadowlands pre-order. As of now, only Drakthir, Earthen, and Haranir cannot be them. This one's tricky, as excluding anyone that wasn't around for the Third War seems too limiting, but the current list feels too open. but I don't know how you draw the line there. I think some, like the cosmically aligned Lightforged Draenei and Void Elves, feel particularly weird as they are now also cosmically aligned with Death, and that gets a bit weird. Monks are really tricky for me. They're currently available to all except Drakthir. Worgen, Goblins, and Lightforged Draenei were holdouts until Dragonflight, but due to the massive role the August Celestials have in their class fantasy, it's honestly hard for me to feel that any race other than Pandaren are actually fitting. I had a Tauren monk at first and had to stop because it just felt weird. I think Brewmaster can kind of sidestep this with the Dwarven races just due to the beer emphasis. And the Orc races kind of fit Windwalker through a Blade Master angle, but even those are stretching it. It's rough for me too, because I'd really like my Shaman to be a Pandaren, and I don't know what to make my monk then. Blizz, please do something to make monks feel better on other races. I beg of you. Time for me to change my tune. Up until now, I've been belly aching about options being too open. Now, I'm doing the opposite. Demon Hunter was pretty terribly implemented, because the unique customizations kind of locked them into just Night Elves and Blood Elves, unless they wanted to do more work. And the only additional race to get access since then has been recently Void Elves, because they pretty much are reskinned Blood Elves. When only 3 of your game's 26 races can be a class, you messed up pretty badly. The thing is, 2 very good options for the class have been completely ignored. Orcs and Draenei, and both had a pretty strong presence on Outland where Illidan was operating. Blizz touted the excuse that elves are particularly susceptible to different forms of magic to reason why only they could be demon hunters, but Draenei, and especially orcs, both change skin color when exposed to Fel. That's a BS excuse. I still think even 5 races would be too limited, but it'd be slightly better at least. And lastly, the worst class concept yet. Evoker. Why would you make a class whose lore restricts them to just one race? I'm sorry, that's just really dumb. I do think there are some inelegant ways to extend the class to other races with any sort of Titan heritage like dwarves, gnomes, humans, earthen, and the like, but so much of the Evoker kit has them flying about and breathing and stuff. You'd have to be more clever about it. Totally doable, I think, but I don't expect to see it anytime soon, if ever. I know lots of players have been clamoring to just extending the Visage form to any race, and that would kind of help, I guess, but it's really not the same thing. So there you have it, my takes on race class combos. The many that shouldn't be there, and the few that aren't but should be. I realize my mostly restrained preferences would ruin a lot of people's fun, and so I'm not advocating Blizz takes anything away. My opinions should often be ignored, and this is definitely one of those cases. But I do think there's just a good amount of questionable combos there. Like, if there are no noteworthy lore characters of any given combo, you should at least start to question whether or not it should exist. And the overall trend has taken away a bit from the racial distinctiveness, which isn't great in an era when the story treats everyone like differently colored humans. Ultimately, I want a healthy balance between logic and choice. Shaman are actually perfect in that regard. 15 out of 26, or 58% of races covered, and they all feel pretty fitting. That should be your relative target, Blizz, in my opinion. I had kind of a hard time deciding who to actually draw for this video, by the very nature of the topic. The most obvious choices were the representatives of the race class combos that I think are stupid, like Mordant Evenshade for Night Elf Mages, or a Pony Brightmane, or Sunwalker Dezco for Tauren Paladins. But as I kind of just established, I think those characters, or at least those combos, are really stupid, so I didn't want to draw them. And on the other hand, combos that I think should exist, like Orc Demon Hunters, just aren't represented. So at the end of the day, I just kind of landed on Kill Jaden. I wanted an excuse to draw him anyway, and I was talking about Eridar Warlocks earlier in the video, so there's that. Kil'jaeden's a bit of a bizarre case. I know he existed in the extended lore as far back as Warcraft 2, but I first met him in the Frozen Throne, where he basically struck me as a recolored Archimonde because they needed someone to replace Archimonde. And I think his character concept became far more rounded when we were introduced to the Draenei in TBC, and his relationship with Velen was established. The dude absolutely hates Velen, but we eventually find out that's because Velen had the strength of character to resist Sargeras' offer, which Kil'jaeden was envious of. I wouldn't say say that makes him an interesting character by any means, but he served his role in the story and I have no real complaints. I drew him in the Tomb of Sargeras since that's the final raid where we encounter him, but instead of on his spaceship, I decided to put him in front of the fallen avatar, cause it's like Sargeras is always looming over his shoulder or something like that. And this way I get to talk about the avatar of Sargeras 2 videos in a row. Will this trend continue in the next video? No. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye bye.